At my parents' 40th anniversary party, I was handed a cheap plastic plate and pointed toward the drafty garage. My mother looked me up and down and said the main dining room was for real family and VIP guests only. I looked through the glass French doors and saw our cousin, the same man who stole our grandmother's antique silver 3 years ago, sitting at the head table drinking vintage champagne. Instead of breaking down in tears like they expected, I simply gripped the red velvet box in my hands, smiled, and walked away. What they did not realize was that the box I was holding did not contain an anniversary gift. It contained a federal foreclosure notice that was about to strip away everything they owned. My name is Danielle, 34 years old, and a forensic accountant specializing in corporate fraud in Chicago. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to smile through the pain of family betrayal, only to serve them the ultimate karma. Growing up in an affluent suburb of Chicago meant maintaining appearances above all else. Our sprawling estate with its perfectly manicured lawns and towering oak trees looked like a picture of American success. But as an accountant, I knew the truth. It was a house built on financial quicksand and emotional manipulation. The air was always thick with unspoken rules about who mattered and who did not. I was the one who did not matter. I walked up the long, sweeping driveway on the night of my parents' 40th wedding anniversary, feeling the familiar chill of my childhood. The crisp October air was filled with the sound of a live jazz quartet spilling out from the open windows of the estate. Valets in crisp white shirts were rushing back and forth, parking a steady stream of luxury vehicles. I smoothed down my sleek black designer dress, taking a deep breath. In my hands, I carried a heavy box wrapped in deep red velvet. The moment I stepped into the grand foyer, the overwhelming scent of expensive catering and imported lilies hit me. Laughter echoed from the main dining room, where crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the wealthy guests. I barely had time to take my coat off before a hand gripped my arm. It was my mother, Patricia. She was wearing a custom silk gown that I estimated cost more than a reliable used car, her face tight with recent cosmetic procedures and profound disapproval. She did not say hello. She did not offer a hug. Instead, she physically blocked my path to the hallway leading to the main event. "You actually came," she whispered sharply, her eyes darting around to make sure none of her country club friends were watching us. "I told you the start time was an hour ago." I smiled politely. "I was working, Mom. It is a busy quarter." She rolled her eyes and shoved a flimsy plastic plate into my hands. It was the kind you buy in bulk, at a discount store, completely out of place in a house currently serving caviar. "Well, we are absolutely at capacity, Danielle. The main hall is for the large family and our most important investors. I cannot have you taking up a seat when Jamal has potential clients here. I set up a spot for you out by the catering overflow." She pointed a perfectly manicured finger toward the side door, the door that led to the garage. I stared at her, letting the silence stretch between us. I looked past her shoulder and through the open double doors into the dining room. It was a sea of people sitting at beautifully decorated round tables with expensive centerpieces and heavy silverware. I scanned the room and my eyes locked onto the VIP table right next to the jazz band. Sitting dead center, laughing with his mouth full of prime rib, was my cousin Kyle. This was the same Kyle who had pawned our grandmother's sterling silver tea set 3 years ago to pay off a gambling debt. The family had quietly covered it up to avoid a scandal. Yet here he was, treated like absolute royalty. A few feet away, I spotted my younger sister Brittany, the undisputed golden child of the family. She was dripping in diamond jewelry that I knew she could not afford parading around the room like she owned the world. Next to her was her husband, Jamal. He was a tall, sharply dressed African-American man with a booming laugh and an undeniable charisma that drew people in. Jamal ran what he called a boutique investment firm, and my parents treated him like he was the second coming of Warren Buffett. They were holding court, pouring champagne for my father's business associates, completely immersed in their illusion of infinite wealth. My mother snapped her fingers in front of my face, pulling my attention back to the cold foyer. Do not make that face, Danielle. You should be grateful we even included you tonight after how distant and unhelpful you have been lately. Just go out to the garage, eat quietly, and do not ruin this night for your sister. The tables are a little wobbly, but it is the best I could do on short notice. I looked down at the cheap plastic plate in my left hand. Then I looked at the heavy red velvet box in my right hand. The box that contained hundreds of pages of court filings, bank transfers, and property deeds. I thought about the years I spent paying my own way through college after my father stole my tuition money. I thought about the thousands of hours I spent investigating their financial ruins while they mocked my career as boring. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice. I simply handed the plastic plate back to my mother, pressing it firmly against her silk gown. "Make this seat bigger," I said loudly, my voice cutting through the jazz music just enough for a few guests to turn their heads, "because I am not sitting in it." Before my mother could process the words, I turned on my heel. The satisfying click of my stilettos echoed against the hardwood floor as I walked right out the heavy front doors and stepped back into the crisp October night. I did not look back even as I heard a sudden commotion behind me. I knew what was coming. The heavy oak doors burst open before I even reached my car. Heavy footsteps crunched violently against the gravel driveway. "Danielle, wait." The voice was deep out of breath and stripped of its usual smooth charm. It was Jamal. I kept walking, fishing my keys out of my clutch. I pressed the unlock button, and the headlights of my Porsche flashed, illuminating the perfectly manicured hedges. Before I could pull the handle, a large hand slammed flat against the driver's side window. Jamal stood between me and my car door, his chest heaving. The cool, wealthy investment banker persona he had been parading around the dining room just minutes ago was completely gone. Up close under the harsh glare of the driveway security lights, he looked frantic. Sweat beaded on his forehead, threatening to ruin his custom-tailored suit. "Move, Jamal," I said, keeping my voice entirely flat. "I have a long drive back to the city." "Come on, Danielle, stop being so dramatic," he scoffed, trying to force a laugh, though his eyes darted nervously back toward the house. "You cannot just storm out of your parents' anniversary party because of a little seating mix-up." Patricia was just stressed. "You know how she gets with the caterers. Do not do this to Brittany. She is in there crying right now because you are trying to ruin a beautiful family moment." I stared at him. The gaslighting was so textbook it was almost boring. Brittany was not crying. Brittany was probably complaining that my departure distracted someone from complimenting her dress. "If she is crying, you should go back inside and comfort her," I replied, stepping forward to force him to move. But Jamal did not budge. Instead, his jaw tightened. He dropped the fake sympathetic brother-in-law act. "Listen to me," he snapped, leaning in closer. His cologne, thick and overpowering, filled the space between us. "You are not leaving yet. You have a responsibility to this family, and you are going to act like an adult for 5 minutes. We need to handle this right now." "Handle what, Jamal?" He reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a folded stack of thick legal paper. He practically shoved it against my chest, forcing me to take it or let it fall to the gravel. I looked down at the document. Even in the dim light, the bold heading at the top was impossible to miss. It was a waiver of rights and release of claims, specifically naming the estate of my late grandfather. "What is this?" I asked, though I knew exactly what it was. "It is just a standard procedural form," Jamal said, quickly waving his hand as if to brush off its importance. His voice sped up, shifting into his practiced salesman pitch. "My firm is closing a massive commercial real estate acquisition next week. We are securing a bridge loan through a private lender, and your parents are acting as partial guarantors using the family assets. The underwriters are just being overly cautious. Since your name was technically mentioned in an old draft of your grandfather's, well, the bank needs you to sign off so there is a clear title. It means nothing. It is just a formality." I slowly unfolded the document, reading the dense legal jargon. My eyes scanned the paragraphs, picking apart the lies in his story word by word. This was not a standard procedural form. This was an ironclad, irrevocable surrender of any and all financial interests related to my grandfather's trust. If I signed this, I would be legally erasing myself from my own inheritance. A formality, I repeated softly, looking back up at him. So you brought a legal waiver to a wedding anniversary party, and my mother just happened to try and hide me in the garage so I would be out of sight when you cornered me to sign it. You are being paranoid. Jamal fired back, his voice rising in frustration. Why do you always have to make everything so difficult? Everyone else in the family is on board. Brittany signed her portion. Your parents signed theirs. We are building generational wealth here, Danielle. My new fund is going to triple their net worth in 2 years. I am trying to lift this whole family up, and you are acting like a bitter outsider holding up progress because your feelings got hurt over a plastic plate. He tapped the paper aggressively with his index finger. Just sign the damn paper. I have a pen right here. Sign it, get in your car, and you can go back to your boring little accounting job in Chicago. We will not bother you again. The sheer audacity of his demand was staggering. He was standing in my driveway attempting to steal my legal birthright while simultaneously insulting my career and calling me a bitter outsider. He genuinely believed his own hype. He thought because he wore a custom suit and talked fast, I would just blindly sign away millions of dollars to avoid an awkward confrontation. He had clearly forgotten what I did for a living. I am a forensic accountant, Jamal. I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper. Do you know what that means? It means I read the fine print for a living. I track hidden assets. I find the money people like you try to hide. And I certainly do not sign waivers in driveways under the threat of family guilt trips. Jamal's eyes flashed with genuine anger. His hand twitched, and for a second I thought he might try to physically force the pen into my hand. Do not play games with me, Danielle. You owe your parents. They raised you. They housed you. You owe them this signature. If you drive away without signing this, you are dead to this family. You will get absolutely nothing. I let out a short, sharp laugh. The sound seemed to catch him completely off guard. He blinked, stepping back slightly as I folded the waiver neatly and slid it into my clutch. I am keeping this, I said. As for getting nothing, Jamal, you have no idea what is actually happening here tonight, do you? You think you are the smartest guy in the room because you convinced 2 desperate aging narcissists to hand over their property deeds to fund your failing business. What are you talking about? He stammered, the color suddenly draining from his face. My business is thriving. We are managing 8 figures. I took a step toward him, closing the distance. My eyes locked onto his wrist, which was resting against my car window. Peeking out from beneath his expensive suit cuff was a thick silver luxury watch. I reached out and tapped the glass face of the watch with my fingernail. It made a hollow, cheap sound. If you are managing 8 figures, Jamal, why does the sweeping hand on your Patek Philippe tick instead of glide? A real automatic movement does not tick. You are wearing a $500 replica. Jamal snatched his arm back as if I had burned him, his confidence shattering in an instant. And that is not the only fake thing about you. I continued, my voice sharp like cracked glass. I know about the tax lien, Jamal. I know the IRS is preparing to audit your boutique firm because you have not paid payroll taxes in 3 quarters. You are not building generational wealth. You are robbing Peter to pay Paul, and you need my grandfather's estate to cover your tracks before the federal government kicks down your office door. Jamal opened his mouth, but no words came out. His chest rose and fell rapidly. He looked terrified. The smooth-talking golden son-in-law had just been completely dismantled in less than 3 minutes. Before he could scramble for another lie, the heavy front doors of the house swung open again. This time, the shrill, amplified voice of my mother echoed across the lawn, projecting through a microphone meant for anniversary toasts. I apologize to all our esteemed guests for the disturbance, Patricia announced, her voice dripping with calculated pity. It seems our oldest daughter is having another one of her episodes outside. We have always struggled with her jealousy and instability. Please do not let her ruin our beautiful evening. Let us raise a glass to family. Hearing my mother use a microphone to publicly humiliate me and brand me as mentally unstable to a room full of Chicago elites was the final spark I needed. I looked at Jamal, who was still frozen against my car, and I smiled. You know what I said, pulling my keys away from the door? I think I will stay a little longer. I turned my back on Jamal, leaving him hyperventilating next to my car, and marched straight toward the massive oak doors of the estate. The heavy fabric of my dress swished around my legs with every purposeful step. I pushed the doors open, stepping out of the crisp October night and back into the suffocating floral-scented air of my childhood home. The warm golden light of the foyer washed over me, a sharp contrast to the cold reality of what I was about to do. I walked down the long hallway toward the main dining room. Through the arched entryway, I could see my mother standing on the small, elevated stage next to the jazz band. She was still holding the silver microphone, her free hand resting elegantly on her chest. She was playing the role of the long-suffering, loving matriarch to absolute perfection. The wealthy guests sitting at the round tables were nodding sympathetically. Some were even giving her small, reassuring smiles, completely buying into the narrative that I was just a jealous, unstable daughter trying to ruin a beautiful evening. Before I could cross the threshold into the dining room, a heavy hand clamped down on my bare shoulder. The grip was tight enough to bruise. I stopped and looked to my left. It was my father, Richard. His face was flushed red with anger, the veins in his neck bulging against the tight collar of his tuxedo shirt. "What the hell do you think you are doing?" he hissed, his voice a venomous whisper, meant only for me. His grip on my shoulder tightened. "Jamal told you to leave. You are making a scene in front of my investors. Turn around, walk out that door, and do not come back until you are ready to apologize and sign that paperwork." I looked down at the hand gripping my shoulder, then back up to his eyes. I did not flinch. I did not shrink away like I would have when I was a teenager. "I am a 34-year-old woman," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "And if you do not remove your hand from my shoulder in the next 2 seconds, I will make a scene that will ensure your investors never return your phone calls again." Richard hesitated. He searched my eyes for any sign of a bluff, but found none. Slowly, he released his grip, stepping back just enough for me to move. I smoothed the fabric of my dress, gave him a cold smile, and stepped past him into the brilliant light of the dining room. The moment the guests noticed me walking toward the stage, a hush fell over the room. The soft chatter died down. The clinking of crystal champagne flutes stopped entirely. Even the jazz band faltered, the saxophone player lowering his instrument as he sensed the shifting tension in the room. My mother saw me approaching, and her perfectly practiced smile froze. Her eyes went wide with genuine panic. She tried to step back, but her high heels caught on the microphone cord. Before she could recover, I walked up the 3 short steps onto the stage. I reached out and smoothly took the microphone from her trembling hand. She opened her mouth to speak, to perhaps call for security, or try to play the victim again, but I did not give her the chance. "Good evening, everyone," I said, my voice echoing clearly through the massive room. "I apologize for the interruption. My mother was just telling you about my little episode outside. It is true I can be quite difficult, but I assure you I am not unstable. I am just allergic to being manipulated." A collective gasp rippled through the front tables. I saw the wives of my father's business partners exchanging shocked glances. My mother stood frozen beside me, her face pale. In the back of the room, my father was aggressively pushing his way through the crowd, trying to get to the stage, but the tightly packed tables were slowing him down. "Since we are all gathered here to celebrate family and legacy," I continued, pacing slowly across the stage, "I thought I should share a quick story about the foundation of this particular family. When I was 18 years old, I worked 3 jobs. I saved every penny I could, and combined with a modest college fund left by my grandmother, I had exactly $40,000 to pay for my university tuition. It was my ticket to building a stable life. But the week before my tuition was due, that account was emptied. I paused, letting the silence hang heavy in the room. I pointed directly at my father, who had just managed to break through to the front of the room. He froze, his face drained of all color. My father, Richard, had forged my signature and drained the entire account, I said, my voice steady and loud. The very next day, he drove a brand new Mercedes-Benz into our driveway. When I confronted him crying because my future had just been erased, he told me that I was being selfish. He told me that a man of his status needed a luxury car to project wealth to his clients and that I should be grateful he was providing a roof over my head. I had to take out massive student loans and work night shifts just to survive. The dining room was dead silent. In the affluent circles of Chicago, taking out aggressive loans was one thing, but stealing a child's education fund to buy a car was considered unforgivably tacky and cruel. The investors my father had been trying to impress were now staring at him with open disgust. Richard stood paralyzed, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. "Shut up!" a shrill voice shrieked from the side of the room. It was my sister Brittany. The golden child could not stand to see her perfect family image shattered, nor could she stand the attention being on anyone but her. She stormed toward the stage, her diamond earrings catching the light, her face twisted in rage. Jamal was trailing a few steps behind her, still looking panicked from our encounter in the driveway. "You are a liar," Danielle Brittany screamed, pointing a manicured finger at me. "You have always been jealous of us. You are just a bitter, lonely accountant who cannot stand that Mom and Dad love me more. You cannot stand that Jamal is building an empire while you sit in a cubicle. You are just trying to ruin my night because you will never be as successful as my husband." I looked down at my sister. She was so blinded by her own entitlement that she had no idea she was walking right into the trap. She had just handed me the perfect transition. I smiled, keeping the microphone close to my mouth. "Am I jealous, Brittany?" I asked softly. "Or am I just the only person in this room who knows how to read a bank statement?" I turned away from her and walked over to the small audio-visual table set up near the edge of the stage. A laptop was connected to the projector, currently displaying a looping slideshow of my parents' vacation photos on the massive white wall behind me. I reached into my clutch and pulled out the small silver USB drive I had brought with me. "Let us talk about Jamal's empire," I said. I unplugged their flash drive, inserted my own, and hit the spacebar. The projector hummed loudly as the massive white wall behind me flickered into life. The carefully curated slideshow of my parents' recent vacation in Tuscany vanished instantly. In its place, a crisp, high-resolution document filled the 20-foot wall, casting a harsh, sterile glow over the dimly lit dining room. It was a consolidated bank statement from an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. At the very top, the account holder name was clearly printed in bold black letters: Jamal Washington, Boutique Investment Partners, LLC. I tapped the silver microphone, ensuring the entire room could hear me over the sudden, confused murmurs that were rippling through the tables. "What you are looking at, ladies and gentlemen, is the actual reality of the financial empire my brother-in-law has built." I directed my attention to a man sitting at the VIP table closest to the stage. "Mr. Henderson, you invested $300,000 with Jamal last month, correct? Jamal promised you a conservative portfolio of municipal tax-free bonds to protect your retirement." Mr. Henderson, a retired surgeon with silver hair and a sharp suit, slowly stood up. He set his crystal champagne flute down so hard that the glass nearly shattered. "Yes," he replied, his voice shaking slightly as he squinted at the giant screen. I clicked the presentation remote in my hand. The slide changed to a wire transfer receipt featuring bank routing numbers and time-stamped authorizations. "Then you might want to ask Jamal why your $300,000 was wired to an unregulated cryptocurrency exchange in the Bahamas exactly 2 days after you handed him the check. And you might also want to ask him why he used it to cover his own personal margin calls on failed crypto trades." I clicked the remote again. "This is a secondary transfer. Jamal routed another $400,000 from other guests in this room through a shell company in Delaware called Apex Holdings, a company registered to a post office box in my sister Brittany's name." The dining room erupted into absolute pandemonium. Chairs scraped violently against the hardwood floor as half a dozen wealthy guests stood up simultaneously. Wives grabbed their husbands' arms in panic. Jamal lunged toward the stage, his face twisted in absolute terror. "Turn that off!" he roared, scrambling desperately over the audio-visual cables. "That is confidential proprietary information. You are hacking my firm. This is corporate espionage and it is highly illegal." I stepped out of his reach, keeping the microphone close to my mouth and my voice perfectly steady. It is not hacking when the information is part of a public federal tax lien filing, Jamal. I clicked the remote one final time. A glaring red document from the Internal Revenue Service appeared on the wall. As of 8 o'clock this morning, Boutique Investment Partners owes the federal government $2.4 million in unpaid payroll and corporate taxes. The firm is completely bankrupt. Jamal has been using the new investment money from the people in this very room to pay off the returns of his early investors. It is a textbook Ponzi scheme, and the FBI already has these exact files. Brittany let out a piercing, hysterical scream. She ran up the wooden stairs of the stage in her designer heels and desperately yanked the thick black power cord from the wall outlet. The projector died instantly, and the wall went completely dark. But it was far too late. The damage was irreparably done. The seed of absolute financial ruin had been planted and was already blooming in the minds of 50 wealthy, angry investors. "You psychotic witch!" Brittany shrieked, throwing the heavy power cord at my feet. "You photoshopped all of that. You are just trying to destroy us because you are miserable and no one will ever love you. Jamal is a financial genius. You are just a jealous accountant." I looked at my sister, whose diamond necklace was shaking violently against her collarbone. "Your genius husband is currently plotting his escape route, Brittany." Everyone turned to look at Jamal. He was no longer trying to defend his business or scream at me. He was slowly backing away from the stage, his eyes darting frantically toward the kitchen doors. But before he could take another step, Mr. Henderson and two other large men blocked his path. They did not look like polite country club friends anymore. They looked like men who had just realized their entire life savings had been incinerated to pay for Jamal and Brittany's luxury lifestyle. "Where exactly are you going, Jamal?" Mr. Henderson asked, his voice low and dangerous. "Pull up my portfolio on your phone right now. Show me the municipal bonds." Jamal stammered, raising his hands in a weak defensive gesture. "Gentlemen, please, the market is incredibly volatile right now. We are just experiencing a temporary liquidity issue due to unforeseen macroeconomic factors. I can explain everything on Monday morning in my office." "Call the police," a woman from the back of the room shouted, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "Check our accounts. He is a fraud." The elegant anniversary party dissolved into a chaotic tribunal. People were shouting, pulling out their phones to check their banking apps, and physically cornering Jamal against the catering tables. I even saw Cousin Kyle quietly stuffing handfuls of silver forks into his jacket pockets, seizing the opportunity of the distraction. The jazz band had quietly packed up their instruments and slipped out the side door, wanting no part of the impending arrests. Amidst the screaming and the panic, my mother pushed her way onto the stage. Her perfect silk gown was wrinkled, her carefully styled hair falling in messy strands around her face. She looked at the ruined party, the furious investors, and the absolute destruction of her social standing. For a narcissist like Patricia, losing her wealthy friends was worse than death. She turned her venomous gaze on me. She marched right up to my face, her chest heaving with rage. "Look at what you have done," she spat, her voice trembling with raw, unadulterated hatred. "You have ruined everything. We gave you life. We put a roof over your head. We allowed you to come to this party, and you repay us by destroying your sister's husband with vicious lies. You always were a cancer in this family." "They are not lies, Mom," I said calmly, looking down at her. "And you know it. You and Dad knew Jamal was in massive legal trouble. That is exactly why you were so desperate for me to sign that waiver out in the driveway. You were going to use my grandfather's trust fund to bail him out and save your own reputations." My father climbed onto the stage, standing shoulder to shoulder with my mother. His face was a mask of pure, violent rage. "You listen to me, you ungrateful little brat," he snarled, pointing a thick finger an inch from my nose. "You are not getting a single dime of that trust. I will tie it up in probate court for the next 20 years if I have to. Now get out of my house. I am calling private security and I am having you physically thrown off this property. You are dead to us. Do you hear me? Get out of my house." He emphasized the words "my house," as if they were a weapon he could use to crush me into submission. He expected me to shatter. He expected the little girl who used to cry in her blue bedroom to finally break under the weight of their combined hatred. Instead, I felt a deep, profound sense of peace settle over me. The chaos of the room seemed to fade into the background. I reached down and picked up the heavy red velvet anniversary box I had placed on the edge of the audio-visual table. I held it out toward them. "I am not going anywhere," I said, "but you should probably open your anniversary present." Patricia slapped the box out of my hands with a furious shriek. It hit the floor hard, the velvet lid popping off and bouncing away. A thick stack of legal documents spilled across the hardwood stage. The documents did not have a decorative ribbon. They had a bright red sticker from the Cook County Sheriff's Office. The heavy silence in the room was deafening. The jazz musicians had completely vanished. The wealthy investors were still processing the absolute destruction of Jamal's hedge fund, but now their attention shifted entirely to the stage. Richard bent down slowly. His knees popped in the quiet room. He reached out with a trembling hand and picked up the top document. I watched the blood drain entirely from his face. His skin turned a sickly shade of gray. He opened his mouth, but only a dry, rasping sound came out. "What is it, Richard?" My mother demanded, her voice shrill and panicked. She snatched the paper from his hand. Her eyes darted rapidly across the bold black text. "Notice of default, foreclosure, writ of possession." "This is a fake!" Patricia screamed, crumpling the edge of the thick parchment. "This is some kind of sick joke. We own this house outright. It has been in the family for 30 years. You cannot foreclose on a house that has no mortgage." I stepped closer to her, my heels clicking sharply against the hardwood. "You never owned this house, Mom. Grandpa Theodore owned this house, and he was not the fool you and Dad always claimed he was." I turned to address the crowd, projecting my voice so every single investor and family friend could hear the depth of their deception. My grandfather knew my father was a financial liability. He watched him burn through business after business, always chasing status instead of stability. So when Grandpa died, he did not leave the estate to his son. He placed this entire property, along with a substantial investment portfolio, into an ironclad trust. A trust that was legally set to transfer sole ownership to me on my 30th birthday. Richard dropped the rest of the papers. He looked like a man who had just been shoved out of an airplane without a parachute. "You have no proof of that," he stammered, sweat pouring down his forehead. "We are the executors. We have the deeds." "You had the deeds," I corrected him, "until you decided to intercept my mail. For 4 years from the day I turned 30, you and Mom hid the letters from the estate attorneys. You bribed the postal worker. You changed the contact information on the trust accounts. You treated my inheritance like it was your personal piggy bank." I looked out into the crowd. "Mr. Harrington, I believe you have something to add." The crowd parted as Mr. Harrington, the senior partner at the law firm that managed my grandfather's estate, stepped forward. He looked incredibly uncomfortable, nervously adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. He held a leather briefcase tightly against his chest. "It is true," Mr. Harrington said, his voice carrying through the silent dining room. "The firm sent multiple notices to Danielle regarding the transfer of the estate. Richard and Patricia intercepted them and claimed Danielle was living abroad and had granted them full power of attorney. We only discovered the fraud when Danielle herself came to my office 3 months ago requesting a full forensic audit of her grandfather's files." Patricia let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob. She stumbled backward, bumping into the dark projector screen. "We are your parents," she wailed instantly, switching tactics to play the ultimate victim. "We kept this house running. We paid the property taxes. We maintained the image of this family. We deserved that money more than you did. You were just going to hoard it in a bank. We needed it to survive." "You did not need it to survive." I fired back, my voice colder than ice. "You needed it to fund Brittany's shopping sprees and Jamal's fake millionaire lifestyle. But hiding the trust was not enough for you, was it, Dad? 2 years ago, when Jamal's Ponzi scheme started collapsing, the first time you needed serious cash to bail him out." Richard shook his head frantically, holding up his hands. "Danielle, please, do not do this here. Not in front of everyone." You forged my signature, I said, ignoring his pathetic pleas. You forged my signature as the sole beneficiary of the trust and took out a $3 million second mortgage on this property. You used a crooked notary. You committed federal mortgage fraud to hand $3 million to a man wearing a fake Rolex. Brittany gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. She looked at Jamal, who was staring at the floor, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. Jamal, she whispered, her voice trembling. Tell me she is lying. Tell me you did not take $3 million from my parents. Jamal said nothing. The reality of his situation was finally crushing him. He was not just looking at basic SEC violations anymore. He was an accessory to massive federal bank fraud. The best part of this entire scheme, I continued, pacing slowly across the stage, is that you were too arrogant to realize how the financial world actually works. When Jamal lost that $3 million in the crypto crash, you stopped making the mortgage payments. The bank issued a notice of default. They were going to seize the house quietly. But banks do not like messy family fraud cases. They prefer to sell toxic debt for pennies on the dollar to private collection firms to wipe their hands clean. I stopped right in front of my parents. They were both trembling now. You thought you got away with it? I whispered, though the microphone picked up every devastating syllable. You thought the bank just forgot about you. You did not realize that the private shell corporation that bought your defaulted debt last month was entirely owned by me. The collective gasp from the room was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard in my entire 34 years on this earth. I bought your debt, I said, staring directly into my mother's terrified eyes. I bought the mortgage you fraudulently took out in my name. I am the bank now, and I am foreclosing. I kicked the scattered legal papers on the floor toward them. So, Mom, you were right when I arrived tonight. The main house is not for me. Because this entire property, the hardwood floors we are standing on, the imported chandeliers above us, and even that drafty garage you tried to banish me to, is now legally my personal property. And your status here tonight is no longer the wealthy hosts of a grand anniversary party. Your status is illegal trespassers. For a long moment, the only sound in the grand dining room was the ragged and uneven breathing of my mother. She stared at the legal papers I had scattered at her designer heels, her mind violently rejecting the reality printed in stark black ink. Then the denial set in. It was a vicious and blinding denial that she had perfected over decades of living far beyond her means and sweeping her ugly truths under the rug. Get out! Patricia hissed, her voice trembling at first before escalating into an ear-piercing shriek. Get out of my house! Get out right now! She lunged forward, not to physically attack me, but to kick the papers away as if they were laced with poison. She kicked them off the edge of the stage, sending them fluttering down onto the expensive tables below. Her face was flushed, her perfect makeup beginning to run, as she frantically tried to regain control of the room. She turned away from me and faced the remaining guests, throwing her hands up in a desperate plea for sympathy. You are all witnessing this, she cried, tears streaming down her face. It was an incredible performance worthy of a daytime television award. Look at what my own daughter is doing to us. On our 40th wedding anniversary. After everything my husband and I have sacrificed for her. She placed a hand over her heart, taking a shuddering breath to emphasize her fabricated pain. I gave you life, Danielle. I stayed awake for nights on end when you had fevers as a child. I bought you beautiful clothes so you would not feel left out at your private school. I put food in your stomach. I gave you the very roof over your head, the roof you are now standing under, trying to steal from your own flesh and blood. How can you be so incredibly cruel and vindictive? She collapsed against my father's shoulder, sobbing loudly. Richard wrapped his arms around her, glaring at me with a mixture of intense hatred and rising panic. A few hours ago, this performance would have worked perfectly. The wealthy guests would have looked at me with disgust, labeling me the ungrateful villain of the family. But I did not interrupt her. I let her weep. I let her perform her monologue of martyrdom, because I knew something she did not yet fully understand. I knew that the people standing in this room were no longer her sympathetic friends. They were Jamal's financial victims, and by extension, they were hers. They were watching her cry about a stolen house while their own life savings had just been completely vaporized to pay for the chandeliers hanging above our heads. "Are you quite finished, Mom?" I asked quietly, my voice slicing right through her theatrical sobbing. I turned away from her and reached my hand back into the deep red velvet box resting on the audiovisual table. The box that was supposed to hold a thoughtful, expensive anniversary gift to celebrate 4 decades of their toxic union. Instead, it was the perfect metaphor for their entire marriage. Beautiful and luxurious on the outside, but holding nothing but cold, hard legal ruin on the inside. I pulled out a thick packet of paper from the very bottom of the box. Unlike the standard foreclosure notices I had tossed onto the floor moments earlier, this particular document was bound with a thick blue ribbon and featured a raised, embossed gold seal from the Federal District Court of Illinois. "You talk about the roof over my head, Mom," I said, holding the heavy document up so the bright stage lights caught the metallic reflection of the federal seal. "But you never provided this roof. You stole it from my grandfather, and then you stole it from me. And do you know what the legal system calls someone who takes out a fraudulent $3 million loan on a property they do not own to fund a lavish lifestyle?" I took a slow, deliberate step toward her. She shrank back against Richard, her fake tears drying up instantly, as genuine fear finally took hold. "They call them criminals," I stated flatly. I held the document out, pointing to the bold black letters printed directly beneath the gold seal. "This is not just a notice of default. This is not a warning from a bank asking nicely for a missed mortgage payment. You ignored all of those 6 months ago. You threw them in the trash because you thought you were completely untouchable in your little suburban fortress." This, I continued, tapping the thick parchment paper, "is an official writ of possession and eviction notice. It was signed yesterday morning by a federal judge. It grants me, the sole legal owner of this estate, the immediate right to repossess the premises and remove any unauthorized occupants." Richard finally found his voice, though it lacked any of its usual booming authority. "You cannot do this," he stammered, his eyes darting frantically around the room looking for an exit. "We have rights. We have squatter rights. We have tenant rights. You have to give us at least 30 days' notice before you can force us out." "I know the law, Danielle. Tenant rights." I laughed, a sharp and bitter sound that echoed off the high ceilings. "You are not a tenant, Dad. You are a hostile occupant who committed massive federal mortgage fraud. And because the original loan was obtained through intentional identity theft and forgery, the judge completely bypassed the standard eviction waiting period. The court recognizes you and Mom as an immediate financial and physical threat to the integrity of this property." Patricia covered her face with her trembling hands, her manicured nails digging into her cheeks. "You are a monster," she wailed, her voice muffled and broken. "You are a cold, heartless monster." "No," I replied, smoothly lowering the document. "I am just a forensic accountant, and the disastrous math of your life has finally caught up with you." I looked past my parents to my sister Brittany, who was standing frozen at the bottom of the stage stairs. Her diamond earrings suddenly looked incredibly heavy. Her husband Jamal was still backed into a corner by the angry investors, desperately trying to negotiate his way out of federal prison. The golden child was finally realizing that her entire safety net had just been incinerated. "You built this entire family dynamic on the idea that I was worthless," I said, addressing all three of them. "You told me I was not good enough for a seat at the main table. You banished me to a plastic folding chair in the garage because you were ashamed of me. Well, congratulations. You finally got exactly what you wanted. I am taking myself out of your family, but I am keeping my house." The words hung in the air, heavier than the crystal chandeliers suspended above our heads. Richard's face contorted into a mask of desperate defiance. "That trust is a piece of garbage," he spat, taking a step toward the stage. "Your grandfather was losing his mind in his final years. He was not of sound mind when he signed those papers. Any competent lawyer will have that irrevocable trust thrown out of probate court by Monday morning. You are bluffing, Danielle." I looked at him with genuine pity. "You really do not listen to anything I say, do you, Dad? I am a forensic accountant. I do not bluff. And there is no probate court. An irrevocable trust bypasses probate entirely." I reached back into the red velvet box and pulled out a thick bundle of envelopes. They were bound tightly together with a thick rubber band. The edges of the envelopes were slightly yellowed, and every single one of them bore the return address of Mr. Harrington's law firm. "Do you recognize these, Mom?" I asked, holding the bundle up for the crowd to see. Patricia stared at the envelopes, her eyes widening in sheer terror. She instinctively took a step backward, bumping into a tray of half-empty champagne glasses on a nearby table. "These are the certified letters Mr. Harrington sent to me starting 4 years ago," I explained, my voice echoing through the silent dining room. "Letters informing me that upon my 30th birthday, I was the sole legal owner of this estate and the accompanying investment portfolios. But I never received them. Because you and Dad bribed the mail carrier. You intercepted federal mail, which is a felony, and you hid them in the floorboard safe in your master bedroom. The same safe where you kept the fake appraisal documents for Jamal's company." The crowd murmured in shock. Mail fraud was a tangible, easily understood crime that destroyed whatever remaining sympathy my parents had in that room. "How did you get those?" Richard demanded, his voice cracking. "That safe was secured." "I own the house, Dad," I replied coldly, "which means I had the legal right to hire a locksmith yesterday afternoon while you were both at the country club getting massages for your big anniversary. I walked right into my house, opened my safe, and retrieved my stolen mail." "We did that to protect you," Richard shouted desperately, pivoting to his favorite tactic of gaslighting. "You were not ready for that kind of responsibility. You would have mismanaged the properties. We were holding the estate together until you were mature enough to handle it. We are your parents. We have a fiduciary duty to guide you." "You have a fiduciary duty to your own greed," I fired back, untying the rubber band and letting the envelopes cascade onto the stage floor. Grandpa Theodore was not senile. He was the smartest man I ever knew. He saw right through your obsession with status. He knew that if he left this estate to you, you would mortgage it to the ground to impress your friends and fund your extravagant lifestyle. He knew you would lose it all. So he built an ironclad legal fortress around his assets and placed the keys entirely in my hands. Brittany, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, finally snapped. She pushed past Jamal and marched toward the stage, her face red and streaked with ruined mascara. "That is not fair," she screamed, stomping her foot like a petulant toddler. "Grandpa loved me too. I am his granddaughter. Half of that trust should be mine. You cannot just steal my inheritance because you found some old letters. I am entitled to that money." I looked down at my younger sister. She was 31 years old, wearing diamonds bought with stolen money, and still throwing tantrums when she did not get her way. "You are entitled to absolutely nothing, Brittany," I said, my voice dropping to a low and authoritative register. "And Grandpa Theodore made that explicitly clear. In the preamble of the trust agreement, he specifically excluded you." "You are a liar!" Brittany shrieked, tears of rage spilling down her cheeks. "Mr. Harrington," I called out to the lawyer standing quietly in the crowd, "would you mind quoting Section 4, Paragraph 2 of my grandfather's trust declaration for my sister?" Mr. Harrington cleared his throat and opened his leather folder. He adjusted his glasses and read loudly enough for the entire room to hear. "I, Theodore, explicitly exclude my granddaughter Brittany from any financial benefit of this trust. I have observed her character and found it entirely lacking. She possesses the same reckless entitlement and financial arrogance as her parents. Any funds given to her would be wasted on vanity. Therefore, she is to receive nothing." Brittany let out a choked gasp as if all the air had been violently punched out of her lungs. She stumbled back, looking around the room at the wealthy guests who were now staring at her with unabashed pity and disgust. The golden child had just been publicly branded as a vain and reckless failure by the patriarch of the family. Behind her, Jamal's expression shifted from panic to absolute realization. He looked at Brittany, the woman he had married solely for her presumed access to generational wealth, and realized she was completely worthless to him. His escape plan was dead. He was married to a woman with no trust fund, living in a house owned by his worst enemy. "He waited until my 30th birthday for a very specific reason," I explained, turning my attention back to my parents. "He wanted to give me time to finish my education, build my career, and understand the true value of money. He wanted me to become a forensic accountant so I would have the exact skills necessary to protect his legacy from people like you. Patricia fell to her knees right there on the hardwood floor. The expensive silk of her custom gown pooled around her as she began to hyperventilate. The reality of the situation was finally breaking through her impenetrable wall of denial. She was not just losing her house. She was losing her social standing, her stolen wealth, and her freedom. "We are your parents," Patricia sobbed, rocking back and forth on the floor. "We gave you life. You cannot do this to us. We will be homeless. We will have nothing. We—" "You made your choices," I said, feeling absolutely zero remorse, as I looked down at the woman who had spent my entire life making me feel small. "You chose to steal my college fund. You chose to intercept my mail. You chose to commit federal mortgage fraud to bail out a con artist. And tonight you chose to put me at a plastic table in the garage because you were ashamed of me." I took a step closer to the edge of the stage, towering over my mother. "The house belongs to me. The trust belongs to me. The legacy belongs to me. And your 4-year masquerade of pretending to be wealthy at my expense is officially over." Richard staggered back as if I had physically struck him. He looked down at his wife, who was still weeping uncontrollably on the floor, and then back at me. His jaw clenched tightly as he attempted to summon one last shred of his patriarchal authority, a desperate man trying to maintain control of a ship that had already sunk to the bottom of the ocean. "You are exaggerating, Danielle," he sputtered, though his voice lacked any real conviction. "It was a simple equity line, a standard loan against a property we maintained and cared for. It is a civil dispute at best. We will simply call the bank on Monday morning and negotiate a payment plan. We have collateral. We have other assets to leverage." "Other assets," I echoed, letting out a sharp and humorless laugh that cut through the tension in the room. "You mean the luxury vehicles leased under Jamal's failing company? Or perhaps the country club membership you have not paid monthly dues on in nearly a year?" I walked over to the scattered legal papers on the floor, my heels clicking loudly and rhythmically in the dead silent room. I bent down, retrieved a specific multi-page contract from the pile, and stood back up, holding it out for him to see. "Let us talk about this simple equity line." "Dad," I said, my voice projecting clearly so every investor in the room could hear the exact mechanics of his crime. "This is the original loan application from First National Trust. It is for a second mortgage in the staggering amount of $3 million. And right here on page 14 is the signature of the sole legal owner of the property authorizing the lien." I walked to the edge of the stage and shoved the paper closer to his face. "Look at it, Richard. Look closely at the signature you paid a crooked suburban notary $500 to authenticate." Richard refused to look. He turned his head away, his face pale and glistening with cold sweat under the bright chandelier lights. "It is a remarkably terrible forgery." I continued, pulling the paper back and examining it myself. "You spelled my middle name with 1 L instead of 2. You were in such a frantic, desperate rush to get your hands on that cash to save Jamal's crumbling business that you could not even properly spell the name of the daughter you were actively robbing." Brittany, who had been staring at Jamal in absolute horror, suddenly turned her misplaced anger back toward me. "They did not just give the money to Jamal," she yelled, her voice cracking as she desperately tried to defend her shattered reality. "Mom and Dad used that money to keep this family afloat. They used it to maintain this beautiful house." "Maintain the house?" I asked, turning my gaze to my sister and raising an eyebrow. "Brittany, the roof on the guest wing has been leaking for 2 years, and the pool heater has been broken since last summer. Do you really want to know where the $3 million actually went? Because as a forensic auditor, tracking stolen money is quite literally what I do for a living." I did not need a projector for this part. I had memorized every single line item, every fraudulent wire transfer, and every desperate purchase that comprised their financial ruin. $400,000 went directly to pay off your platinum credit cards, Brittany, I stated clearly, watching her physically flinch as if I had slapped her. "Another $200,000 paid for the down payments on your matching imported SUVs. $50,000 went to the overpriced interior designer who decorated your rented office space so Jamal could look like a Wall Street titan to his victims. But the vast majority of it, $2.3 million, was wired directly into Jamal's offshore accounts to pay off the early investors he defrauded, just to keep the federal regulators off his back for another 18 months. The wealthy guests in the room, the very people Jamal had been actively soliciting for new investments all night, began to murmur angrily. They were finally realizing that my parents had committed federal crimes just to keep up a fake facade of wealth, and they had willingly dragged innocent people down with them to fund the illusion. "It is a misunderstanding," Patricia sobbed from the floor, her hands desperately grasping at the hem of my designer dress. I stepped back instantly, repulsed by her touch, leaving her grasping at empty air. "We can fix this, Danielle." Patricia pleaded, her makeup smeared into dark, muddy streaks across her cheeks. "We will sell my jewelry. We will talk to the bank manager. We have known him for years. He comes to our summer barbecues. He will give us an extension." "There is no bank manager to talk to, Mom," I said smoothly. She looked up at me, confusion briefly breaking through her sheer panic. "What do you mean?" "Banks despise fraud," I explained, pacing slowly across the stage. "When a loan of this massive magnitude goes into default, and the bank discovers the underlying collateral was secured through blatant identity theft, they do not want the public relations nightmare of a messy trial. They want the toxic asset off their books immediately." I paused, letting the harsh reality of corporate finance sink into her mind. "When you stopped making the monthly payments 6 months ago, First National Trust flagged the account. Because I had already established my legal ownership of the trust with Mr. Harrington, I was immediately notified of the default. But instead of reporting you to the police right then and letting the bank take my family home, I went to work." Richard stared at me, his eyes wide with a terrifying realization. "What did you do?" he whispered, his voice trembling. "I set up an anonymous shell corporation in Delaware." I said, a cold smile touching my lips. "I used the liquid capital from Grandpa Theodore's investment portfolio, the cash reserves you could not reach, because they were locked behind biometric security protocols. I took my own money, and I approached the bank's distressed asset division. The silence in the room was absolute. Everyone was hanging on my every word, watching a masterclass in financial retribution unfold before their eyes. "I offered to buy your toxic debt outright," I continued, locking eyes with my father. "Banks sell defaulted loans for pennies on the dollar just to clear their ledgers and avoid litigation. I purchased your $3 million fraudulent mortgage for exactly $600,000. The bank legally assigned the lien to my corporation. I now hold the original property deed, the grandfathered trust, and the defaulted debt." Richard's knees finally buckled. He stumbled backward and heavily collapsed into a nearby dining chair, his hands gripping his hair in absolute defeat. "So, when you say you are going to call the bank on Monday morning to beg for an extension, Mom," I concluded, my voice ringing with finality, "you are fundamentally misunderstanding your predicament. You cannot call the bank, because I am the bank, and I do not negotiate with criminals." The finality of my words hung over the room, heavy and absolute. I did not negotiate with criminals. Richard remained slumped in the dining chair, staring blankly at the polished hardwood floor, while Patricia continued to sob, her cries echoing into the cavernous ceiling. But the stunned silence from the crowd did not last long. The wealthy elites of Chicago did not tolerate being made fools of, and they certainly did not tolerate losing their money. The pity they initially felt for my mother had completely evaporated in an instant, replaced by a cold and calculating fury. Mr. Henderson, the retired surgeon who had spoken up earlier, turned away from the stage and marched directly toward Jamal. His silver hair caught the light as he moved with surprising speed for a man his age. He did not ask this time. He demanded, "I want my $300,000 transferred back into my primary checking account right now, Jamal." Mr. Henderson growled, pulling out his smartphone and shoving it directly toward Jamal's chest. "Open your banking app. Do it right here, right now. You said you had liquid assets ready to deploy. Deploy them back to me." Before Jamal could even formulate a lie, two other men joined Mr. Henderson. One was a prominent real estate developer who had just finalized a $500,000 investment with Jamal the previous week. They aggressively boxed Jamal in against the elaborate caviar and oyster station set up near the kitchen doors. Gentlemen, please step back, Jamal stammered, raising his hands defensively. The cheap replica watch on his wrist suddenly looked absurdly glaring under the crystal chandeliers. The markets are closed. I cannot authorize a wire transfer of that magnitude on a Saturday night. It triggers federal security protocols. We have to wait for the clearinghouses to open on Monday. Do not lie to me, the real estate developer shouted, grabbing Jamal by the lapel of his expensive custom suit. Danielle just proved you do not even have a real brokerage account. You took our money and sent it to an offshore crypto exchange. You are a thief. You used my investment to pay for this absurd party. Jamal looked wildly around the room for help, but there was none to be found. The very people he had spent the last 3 hours charming, laughing with, and pouring vintage wine for were now circling him like sharks sensing blood in the water. His polished facade was entirely gone. Sweat was pouring down his face, and his eyes darted toward the exit, calculating the distance between the caviar station and the heavy front doors. Brittany tried to intervene, completely oblivious to the danger she was putting herself in. She pushed her way through the tight circle of angry investors, her diamond necklace flashing under the lights. "Take your hands off my husband," she shrieked, positioning herself in front of Jamal like a shield. "You cannot treat us like this. Do you know who we are? My parents have been members of your country club for 20 years. We sit on the charity board with your wives. You are being ridiculous over a simple accounting error." A woman in a sleek emerald gown laughed bitterly from the edge of the crowd. "Your parents are broke frauds, Brittany, and your husband is going to federal prison. The only place you are going is bankruptcy court. Do not ever speak to me again." Brittany flinched as if she had been physically slapped. The social currency she had relied on her entire life, the unearned privilege she wielded like a weapon against me, was suddenly completely worthless. She turned back to our father, crying out for him to do something, begging him to throw these people out of the house. But Richard did not move a single muscle. He just sat there in the dining chair, a broken shell of a man who had finally been crushed by the weight of his own profound arrogance. I stepped down from the wooden stage, the federal writ of possession still held firmly in my hand. The angry crowd parted for me instantly. The power dynamic in the room had shifted so entirely that no one dared stand in my way. I was no longer the outcast daughter. I was the architect of their ruin. I walked over to the head caterer, a nervous-looking man who was tightly gripping a silver tray of empty champagne flutes. "You and your staff are doing a wonderful job tonight," I told him, keeping my voice calm and polite to contrast the screaming happening a few feet away. "But the people who hired you do not actually own this property, nor do they have the money to pay your final invoice tonight. I am the legal owner. Please pack up your equipment and leave your invoice on the kitchen island. I will ensure you are paid in full by my accounting firm on Monday morning." The caterer nodded frantically, signaling his staff to immediately start pulling plates from the tables. I turned back to face my parents and the remaining guests, raising my voice just enough so it carried over the angry demands of the investors surrounding Jamal. "So, Mom, you were right when I arrived tonight," I announced, making sure every syllable landed with maximum impact. "The main house really is not for me, because this entire property is now legally mine, and your status here is illegal trespassers. The party is officially over." Patricia let out a fresh wail of absolute despair, burying her face in her hands and rocking back and forth on the floor. The elegant anniversary celebration instantly transformed into an absolute nightmare for the villains of my story. It was a spectacular, uncontrolled implosion. Wives were aggressively grabbing their coats from the coat check, whispering furiously to each other about calling their defense attorneys first thing Monday morning. Some were frantically texting their accountants to freeze their assets. The jazz band members who had peeked back in to see the commotion quickly grabbed their instrument cases and sprinted out the back door without saying a word. Jamal was practically pinned against the wall by 4 different men demanding their life savings back. His smooth charisma was entirely gone, replaced by the pathetic sweating panic of a cornered con artist. He tried to push past them, muttering something about needing to get his financial ledger from his car, but Mr. Henderson shoved him firmly back against the wall, sending a silver tray of oysters crashing to the floor. "You are not going anywhere until the authorities arrive." Mr. Henderson declared, his face red with fury. He signaled to another guest across the room. "Call the police. Tell them we are holding a man for grand larceny and wire fraud." I stood in the center of my grand dining room and watched the empire of lies crumble into dust. For 34 years, my family had made me feel like an outsider, a failure, a severe disappointment. They had gaslighted me, stolen my education fund, and banished me to a plastic table in the garage just to keep up their pathetic facade of superiority. Now that facade was completely destroyed, and the ugly reality was fully exposed under the bright lights. They were broke, desperate criminals, and I was the one holding all the cards. The heavy silence following my declaration did not last. The tension in the room had stretched so tight it finally snapped, but the explosion did not come directed at me. My mother, still kneeling on the floor, surrounded by the scattered evidence of her federal crimes, slowly lifted her head. Her smeared makeup made her look completely unhinged. She looked past me, her eyes locking entirely onto my father. Richard was still slumped in his dining chair, staring blindly at the floor, absolutely useless. The realization that her husband had failed to secure the forgery, failed to protect her social standing, and failed to outsmart the daughter she despised finally broke whatever shred of loyalty she had left for him. Patricia scrambled to her feet. The elegant silk of her custom gown caught on her heel, tearing loudly, but she did not even flinch. She stormed over to Richard. "You complete idiot!" she shrieked, her voice cracking with raw, unadulterated hysteria. She raised her hand and struck him viciously across the face. The slap echoed through the massive dining room like a gunshot, silencing the angry investors for a split second. Richard recoiled, his hand flying to his rapidly reddening cheek, his eyes wide with shock. "You could not even spell her middle name right," Patricia screamed, pointing a trembling manicured finger right between his eyes. "I told you to hire a professional. I told you that cheap suburban notary you found at the golf course was a massive liability. But you are always so cheap when it actually matters, Richard. You ruined everything. You lost my house." Richard leaped out of his chair, his previous defeat instantly boiling over into violent defensive rage. "Your house," he roared back, stepping aggressively into her personal space. "You mean the house you insisted we mortgage so you could host a $40,000 garden party last spring to impress women who do not even like you. Do not put this all on me, Patricia. You spent $100,000 on custom Italian furniture for a guest house nobody uses. You bled me dry for 30 years to pretend you were royalty." While my parents were ruthlessly tearing each other apart over Italian furniture and botched forgeries, Brittany was experiencing her own catastrophic collapse. She watched our parents screaming like cornered animals, then frantically grabbed Jamal's arm. Jamal was still backed against the wall, guarded by Mr. Henderson and the other furious investors. "Jamal, we need to go," Brittany pleaded, her voice high and desperate, completely ignoring the men surrounding them. "Call your driver. We will go to the penthouse in the city. We can call your defense lawyers from there and figure this out. Leave them here. They are insane." Jamal looked down at the woman gripping his expensive suit sleeve. The charming, doting husband act he had played flawlessly for 3 years vanished in the blink of an eye. He yanked his arm away so violently that Brittany stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a fallen chair. "Do not touch me!" Jamal spat, his deep voice dripping with absolute disgust. Brittany gasped, her eyes wide with shock. "Jamal, what are you doing? I am your wife. We are a team. We can start over." "A team?" Jamal laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that held zero humor. "We are not a team, Brittany. You are a massive liability. The penthouse is rented, the cars are leased, and the only reason I ever looked twice at you is because your desperate father promised me a $2 million capital injection from your grandfather's trust fund the day we got married." The immediate circle of investors gasped. Brittany froze, her face turning chalk white under the crystal chandeliers. "What are you talking about?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the shouting of our parents nearby. "You love me. We built an empire together. I built a house of cards." Jamal corrected her brutally, taking a step toward her and towering over her trembling frame. And your father told me that if I married the pretty spoiled daughter and kept her distracted with shiny things, he would give me access to the family wealth. But there is no family wealth, is there? You are completely broke. You have no trust fund. You have no actual skills. You spend $30,000 a month on clothes and spas, and you do not even know how to balance a checkbook. You are entirely useless to me. Brittany let out an agonizing guttural scream. The illusion of her perfect life, her superior status, and her loving marriage shattered into a million sharp pieces. She lunged at Jamal, her manicured nails aimed directly at his face. She clawed at his cheeks, screaming every vile insult she could think of. Jamal grabbed her wrists, shoving her backwards so hard she crashed into the dessert table. A towering display of macarons and a crystal punch bowl shattered onto the floor, covering her designer dress in sticky red liquid and broken glass. Richard saw Jamal push his golden child and completely lost his mind. He abandoned his screaming match with Patricia and charged at Jamal, tackling him directly into the caviar station. The two men crashed to the hardwood floor in a massive tangle of expensive suits, crushed ice, and silver platters. "Get your hands off my daughter, you lying thief!" Richard roared, throwing a clumsy punch that caught Jamal right in the jaw. Jamal hit him back immediately, his fist connecting heavily with Richard's nose. Blood instantly spurted across Richard's crisp white tuxedo shirt. "You set me up!" Jamal yelled, pinning Richard to the floor. "You lied to me about the trust. You ruined my life." Patricia began screaming at the top of her lungs, grabbing a heavy silver serving spoon from the floor and hitting Jamal on the back to get him off her bleeding husband. Brittany was sitting in a puddle of spilled punch, wailing hysterically and pulling at her own blonde hair in complete devastation. I took a few slow steps backward, removing myself completely from the violent chaos unfolding in the center of the room. I looked around at the 150 wealthy guests. None of them were intervening. None of them were calling for security or trying to stop the fight. Instead, the elite, sophisticated members of Chicago society were standing in a wide circle holding up their smartphones. Flashbulbs went off rapidly. The cameras were rolling. Every humiliating scream, every drop of blood, every vile secret screamed across the room was being permanently recorded by the very people my parents had sacrificed everything to impress. The perfect family was completely cannibalizing itself. The facade was not just cracked, it was obliterated. All it took to destroy them was forcing them to face the absolute truth of their own boundless greed. I stood quietly by the grand staircase of my house, watching the people who had abused me my entire life tear each other to shreds, knowing I had finally won. The chaotic brawl on the dining room floor slowly ground to a pathetic halt. Richard was gasping for air, clutching his bleeding nose, his expensive tuxedo ruined beyond repair. Jamal shoved him away and leaned heavily against the wall, trapped by the wall of furious investors who refused to let him out of their sight. Brittany remained seated in the puddle of spilled fruit punch, weeping into her hands as the reality of her shattered golden child status finally took hold. I raised my left arm and looked at my watch. The subtle movement caught the attention of the room, and the murmuring guests fell silent once again, their smartphone cameras still pointed in our direction. "It is currently 9:15 in the evening," I announced, my voice slicing through the heavy, humid air of the ruined dining room. "By the authority granted to me by the federal court order I am holding in my hand, I am officially executing the eviction. Patricia, Richard, Brittany, and Jamal. You have exactly 30 minutes to gather whatever personal belongings you can fit into your vehicles and leave my property." The words hung in the air, absolute and uncompromising. 30 minutes. Richard choked out, spitting blood onto the hardwood floor. "You cannot be serious. We have lived here for 30 years. We have a lifetime of possessions in this house. You cannot expect us to pack our entire lives into the trunks of our cars in half an hour." "I am completely serious," I replied, stepping down from the bottom stair and walking toward them. "And let me clarify the terms of your departure. You are permitted to take your personal clothing, your toiletries, and any everyday items you brought into this house. Everything else, the antique furniture, the artwork on the walls, the silver in the dining room, and every single asset purchased with funds from the fraudulent mortgage remains here. It belongs to the estate. If I see anyone trying to walk out of those front doors with so much as a candlestick, I will have you arrested for theft before you even reach the driveway." Patricia, who had been sitting in stunned silence since slapping her husband, suddenly snapped out of her shock. The tyrant who had spent my entire life dictating my worth, mocking my career, and banishing me to the shadows, instantly transformed into a weeping, helpless victim. She scrambled across the floor on her hands and knees, the ripped fabric of her custom silk gown tangling around her legs. She reached out and desperately grabbed the hem of my skirt. "Danielle, please," she sobbed, looking up at me with wide, terrified eyes. Her mascara had run completely down her cheeks, making her look like a deranged ghost. "You cannot do this to us. It is freezing outside. We do not have any cash on hand. Our credit cards are maxed out because of the party. Where are we supposed to go? We will be out on the street." I looked down at the woman who had birthed me, feeling an overwhelming sense of emptiness. There was no love left. There was no anger left. There was only the cold, hard math of consequence. "You should have thought about your housing situation before you forged my signature to steal $3 million, I said, looking her directly in the eyes. "I am your mother," she wailed, her grip tightening on my dress. "I raised you. I loved you in my own way. You cannot throw your own mother out into the cold night. Have some mercy. We will sleep in the guest wing. We will stay out of your way. We will do whatever you want. Please, Danielle, do not put us on the street." I reached down and firmly pried her fingers off my dress, stepping back to create a physical boundary between us. "I am not putting you on the street, Mom," I said smoothly, my voice devoid of any emotion. "There is a folding table out in the garage. You can sleep under that." The collective gasp from the guests was audible. The poetic justice of my statement resonated through the room. Less than an hour ago, she had tried to banish me to that exact table because she was too ashamed to let her wealthy friends see me. Now she was the one begging for a corner to sleep in, and the wealthy friends were watching her absolute humiliation. "You are evil," Brittany screamed from the floor, throwing a handful of crushed macarons in my direction. They scattered harmlessly across the wood. "You are a cold, heartless psychopath. I am not leaving. This is my home, too." "This has never been your home, Brittany," I corrected her sharply. "And as for leaving, you do not have a choice. At 9:45, the doors to this house will be locked. Anyone who is not on the guest list and is still standing inside these walls will be formally charged with criminal trespassing." I turned to Jamal, who was still boxed in by Mr. Henderson and the others. "Jamal, I suggest you take this time to gather your things as well. Although considering the men standing around you have already called the authorities, I highly doubt you will be driving those leased luxury cars anywhere tonight." Jamal's eyes widened in sheer panic. He looked at the angry investors, then at the front door. He realized he was entirely trapped. "Your time is ticking," I announced to my parents, tapping the face of my watch. 27 minutes left. I highly suggest you stop crying on my floor and start packing." The sheer authority in my voice finally broke through their denial. Richard scrambled to his feet, ignoring the blood dripping from his chin, and sprinted toward the grand staircase leading to the master bedroom. Patricia let out a final agonizing wail before pushing herself up and stumbling awkwardly after him, her broken heel clicking unevenly against the wood. Brittany sat on the floor for a moment longer, looking wildly around the room for someone, anyone, to come to her rescue. But every single face staring back at her was filled with disgust. Realizing she was entirely alone, she scrambled up and ran toward the guest wing, leaving a trail of sticky punch behind her. The frantic scramble was pathetic to watch. The wealthy hosts of the 40th anniversary gala were now running through the halls of a house they did not own, frantically stuffing designer clothes into garbage bags because they did not have enough suitcases. From the dining room, I could hear drawers being ripped open, hangers clattering to the floor, and my parents screaming at each other upstairs as they fought over what to pack. I walked over to the nearest table and picked up a clean champagne flute. I poured myself a small amount of vintage champagne that had been abandoned by a fleeing guest. I took a slow sip, enjoying the crisp, expensive taste, and watched the second hand on my watch sweep steadily forward. The countdown had begun, and the era of their reign was officially over. While the upstairs floors sounded like a panicked stampede, The main level was buzzing with the hushed, angry whispers of the remaining investors. I stood by the grand staircase, finishing the last drops of my vintage champagne. My eyes scanned the room, settling on the corner where Jamal had been pinned. Mr. Henderson and the real estate developer had briefly stepped away to confer with their respective defense attorneys on their cell phones, mistakenly assuming that a man facing complete financial ruin would simply stand against the wall and wait for the local police to arrive. They underestimated the survival instincts of a cornered predator. Jamal was gone. I set my empty crystal flute down on a passing tray and walked deliberately toward the back of the house. The sprawling layout of the estate meant there were multiple exit points, but the French doors in the catering kitchen offered the fastest route to the wooded perimeter of the property. I moved silently down the long, dimly lit hallway, my stilettos making barely a sound on the thick Persian runners. As I passed the expansive butler pantry, a sharp metallic clatter broke the silence. I stopped and pushed the swinging wooden door open. Inside, illuminated only by the faint glow of the under-cabinet lighting, was Cousin Kyle. He had completely abandoned the VIP table and was now frantically stuffing handfuls of my grandmother's antique sterling silverware into the deep pockets of his oversized jacket. He froze like a deer in headlights when the door swung open, a silver gravy ladle dangling comically from his left hand. "Kyle," I said softly, my voice completely devoid of surprise. "I told you that anything purchased with the fraudulent mortgage stays. The silverware, however, is a family heirloom. Put it back." Kyle swallowed hard, his eyes darting toward the exit. "Come on, Danielle. The ship is sinking. Your parents are going down. Jamal is going down. I just need a little something to tide me over. It is rough out there right now." "It is going to be much rougher if you do not empty your pockets in the next 5 seconds, I replied, crossing my arms. "I am the sole owner of this estate now. That makes this a burglary. And unlike my parents, I will not quietly cover up your petty theft to save the family image." Kyle let out a frustrated groan, violently yanking the silverware out of his pockets and tossing it onto the marble counter. The heavy silver clattered noisily. He threw the gravy ladle down with a pathetic scowl, pushed past me without making eye contact, and sprinted toward the front door. He was a rat, fleeing a sinking ship exactly as I expected. I continued down the hallway, finally reaching the heavy swinging doors of the catering kitchen. The catering staff had completely evacuated the space, leaving behind half-prepared hors d'oeuvres and stacks of dirty plates. Standing near the back exit, struggling to quietly unlock the deadbolt, was Jamal. Over his shoulder, he had slung a heavy canvas duffel bag that I instantly recognized. It belonged to my father. Judging by the distinct, heavy clinking sound it made as it hit the doorframe, Jamal had raided the master study on his way down, likely clearing out my mother's jewelry box and the emergency cash safe my father kept hidden behind his desk. "Going somewhere, Jamal?" I asked, my voice slicing through the quiet kitchen. Jamal whipped around his hand, still gripping the brass deadbolt. His custom suit was wrinkled, his tie was completely askew, and the bruise on his jaw from my father's punch was already turning a deep, ugly shade of purple. The smooth, arrogant investment banker was entirely gone. He looked like a common street thief caught in the act. "Get out of my way, Danielle," he snarled, taking a step toward me. The heavy duffel bag swung against his hip. "I am not going to stand here and let a bunch of rich, angry old men hold me hostage until the local cops show up. I have a private car waiting 2 miles down the road. You got your house back. You embarrassed everyone. You won. Now back off and let me walk out this door." I did not move an inch. I looked at the heavy bag over his shoulder. "You really think you can just walk away from stealing millions of dollars by slipping out the back door with my mother's diamond necklaces? Mr. Henderson called the police 10 minutes ago." Jamal let out a short, arrogant laugh, his confidence briefly returning as he looked down at me. "Local cops take 20 minutes to respond to a non-violent white-collar dispute in this neighborhood. By the time they roll up the driveway and start taking statements from those country club idiots, I will be on a private tarmac. I know how the system works. They are too slow." Jamal reached for the door handle again, turning the deadbolt with a sharp click. But before he could pull the door open, the frosted glass panes suddenly illuminated. Bright, blinding flashes of red and blue light violently pierced the darkness of the kitchen, reflecting off the stainless steel appliances in a dizzying strobe effect. The sudden piercing wail of multiple sirens erupted from the driveway, echoing deafeningly against the surrounding trees. It was not just one police cruiser. The heavy crunch of tires on gravel indicated a massive coordinated perimeter breach. Armed officers were already shouting instructions outside the back door. Jamal froze. The heavy duffel bag slipped from his shoulder, hitting the tile floor with a loud metallic crash. His eyes were wide with sheer, unadulterated terror as the red and blue lights washed over his face. He stumbled backward away from the door, his breathing shallow and rapid. "They cannot be here this fast," he whispered, his voice trembling uncontrollably. "A standard fraud call does not trigger a raid like this." "You are right," I said, taking a slow step toward him as the pounding on the back door began. "A phone call from an angry investor about a bad trade does not trigger a tactical response. But a 60-page dossier detailing wire fraud, offshore tax evasion, and a multi-million-dollar forged mortgage does." Jamal stared at me, his jaw completely slack. "What did you do?" "I did not just buy the defaulted debt from the bank last month, Jamal. I am a forensic accountant. I build airtight cases for a living. 2 days ago, I walked into the Chicago field office of the FBI. I handed them the forged mortgage documents with your signature on the wire transfers. I handed them the offshore routing numbers you used to funnel the stolen money. I handed them the exact location of the cryptocurrency exchange where you hid the assets. The federal government has been sitting outside this estate in unmarked vehicles for the last 2 hours, waiting for me to secure the premises and isolate the targets." Jamal shook his head frantically, backing up until his spine hit the stainless steel refrigerator. "No. No, you could not have. The investors calling the police tonight was just the cherry on top." I continued, my voice cold and unyielding. "The FBI already had the arrest warrant signed by a federal judge yesterday afternoon. You were never going to make it to a private tarmac, Jamal. You were never going to outsmart the system. Because I am the system." A loud, authoritative voice boomed from the other side of the kitchen door. "FBI, open the door immediately." I looked at my African-American brother-in-law, watching the absolute destruction of his fake empire settle into his eyes. The arrogance, the manipulation, and the blatant theft had finally reached the end of the line. There was no charm left to save him. I stepped forward, reached past his trembling shoulder, and unlocked the heavy back door. As soon as the deadbolt clicked, the door was pulled violently open from the outside. A flood of cold night air rushed into the warm catering kitchen, followed immediately by half a dozen federal agents wearing dark tactical gear. The crisp white lights of the kitchen reflected off the bold yellow letters printed across their heavy bulletproof vests. Jamal did not even attempt to run. His knees buckled instantly. He collapsed onto the white tile floor, his hands instinctively raising above his head in complete surrender. The heavy canvas duffel bag filled with my mother's stolen jewelry lay abandoned inches from his expensive designer shoes. 2 agents moved in swiftly, forcing him flat onto his stomach. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around his wrists echoed off the stainless steel appliances, a sound so final and absolute it sent a shiver of pure satisfaction down my spine. Jamal Washington, the lead agent, announced, his voice a booming baritone that left no room for negotiation. "You are under arrest for multiple counts of federal wire fraud, securities fraud, and operating an unlicensed financial syndicate. You have the right to remain silent." Jamal was openly weeping now, his tears mixing with the dust on the kitchen floor. He gasped for air, hyperventilating, as the Miranda rights were read to him. The suave, arrogant financial prodigy who had insulted me in the driveway just an hour ago was completely gone, replaced by a broken, terrified criminal. I stepped aside, watching dispassionately as the agents hauled him to his feet. I followed the lead agent as he pushed through the swinging wooden doors, marching Jamal out of the kitchen and directly into the grand dining room. The moment we stepped into the main house, a collective gasp swept through the remaining guests. The room was instantly bathed in the flashing red and blue lights pouring through the massive front windows. The jazz music was long gone, replaced by the harsh mechanical crackle of police radios. Uniformed local police officers were already pouring through the front doors to secure the perimeter, blocking any chance of escape. Just as Jamal was being paraded through the crowd, heavy footsteps thumped rapidly down the grand staircase. It was my father. Richard was sweating profusely, awkwardly, carrying two large black garbage bags stuffed with his custom-tailored suits and silk ties. He was in such a frantic rush to flee his own anniversary party that he did not even look at the bottom of the stairs until it was too late. When Richard finally looked up and saw the lobby swarming with federal agents and local police, he froze entirely. His face went completely slack. He dropped the garbage bags. One of them snagged on the sharp edge of the wooden banister and ripped wide open, spilling expensive silk shirts and cashmere sweaters all over the carpeted stairs. "Richard," I called out, my voice ringing clearly across the silent lobby. "Your ride is here." Two agents immediately rushed the staircase. Richard tried to take a step backward, raising his hands in a weak, pathetic gesture of defense, but he was completely outmatched. The agents grabbed his arms, spinning him around and slamming him firmly against the expensive floral wallpaper he had forced my mother to buy last spring. "Richard, you are under arrest for federal mortgage fraud, aggravated identity theft, and conspiracy to commit bank fraud," the arresting officer stated loudly, securing the handcuffs behind my father's back. My mother, Patricia, appeared at the top landing of the staircase just in time to witness the arrest. She was clutching a jewelry box to her chest, her ruined silk gown trailing behind her. She let out a blood-curdling scream that echoed terribly through the high ceilings. "Get your hands off him!" Patricia shrieked, stumbling frantically down the stairs. She nearly tripped over the spilled clothing as she rushed toward the agents. "Do you know who we are? Unhand my husband right now. This is a massive misunderstanding." A female officer immediately stepped forward, placing a firm hand on my mother's shoulder and physically blocking her path. "Ma'am, you need to step back right now or you will be charged with obstruction of justice," the officer warned sternly. Patricia collapsed against the wooden banister, sobbing uncontrollably into her hands. Her perfect suburban empire had just been burned to the ground in front of her eyes. At the exact same moment, Brittany emerged from the guest wing hallway. She had managed to change out of her ruined, punch-stained dress into a pair of sweatpants, her blonde hair a messy, tangled bird's nest. She took one look at her father, pinned against the wall, and her husband standing in handcuffs, surrounded by the FBI, and she completely froze. She sank slowly down the wall, curling her knees to her chest, staring blankly ahead, as her brain simply refused to process the complete destruction of her life. While my family was experiencing the darkest moment of their lives, the wealthy guests in the dining room were experiencing a very different kind of urgency. The men and women who had just discovered their life savings were tied up in Jamal's Ponzi scheme were not going to sit quietly and wait for a courtroom battle. They wanted blood, and they wanted it immediately. Mr. Henderson, the retired surgeon, wasted absolutely no time. He marched directly up to the lead FBI agent in the center of my living room. "Agent, my name is Arthur Henderson," he said clearly and loudly, pulling out his smartphone. "I am a primary investor in Jamal Washington's firm. I have digital receipts, time-stamped emails, and direct routing numbers for every single fraudulent wire transfer he initiated over the last 12 months. I want to give a full recorded statement right now." The real estate developer stepped up right beside him. "So do I," he added eagerly. "I have voicemail recordings of Richard explicitly guaranteeing my investment using the fraudulent equity of this estate." Within minutes, my elegant living room was transformed into an impromptu federal interrogation center. The elite members of Chicago society formed a literal line in my foyer, eagerly waiting their turn to speak to the investigators. Wives were pulling up their investment portfolios on their tablets while husbands dictated exact dates and dollar amounts to the agents taking notes on their clipboards. The wealthy guests were frantically throwing Jamal and Richard to the wolves, desperate to ensure their own names were cleared and their assets protected. The sheer volume of voluntary evidence being handed over was staggering. It was the ultimate legal payoff. There would be no high-priced defense attorneys spinning the truth, no prolonged investigations to find hidden documents, and no possibility of bail. with 50 billionaires giving simultaneous corroborating statements about the financial crimes they had just witnessed. Jamal and Richard were completely hopelessly trapped. I stood near the grand fireplace, entirely untouched by the chaos swirling around me, and watched the officers prepare to march the two men out into the cold night. The arrogant men who had thought they could steal my future and cast me aside were now standing shoulder to shoulder in matching steel handcuffs, completely at the mercy of a justice system they thought they were too smart to face. The arresting officers did not give my father a single moment to collect his scattered garbage bags of clothing. They firmly gripped Richard by the upper arms and marched him away from the grand staircase, his expensive custom-tailored tuxedo pulling awkwardly across his shoulders, where his hands were bound tightly behind his back. The crisp white fabric of his shirt was still heavily stained with bright red blood from his pathetic brawl with Jamal. He looked absolutely ridiculous, a far cry from the domineering, arrogant patriarch who had ordered me to sit in the garage just a few hours earlier. My mother was next. A stern female federal agent escorted Patricia through the foyer, keeping a tight grip on her elbow. Patricia's custom silk gown, which she had spent months having tailored specifically to impress the wealthy elite of Chicago tonight, was now torn at the hem. It was stained with spilled wine fruit punch and dirt from her hysterical collapse on the dining room floor. Her carefully styled hair had completely unraveled, hanging in limp, sweaty blonde strands around her pale, tear-streaked face. She stumbled in her expensive heels, her wrists locked together in heavy steel cuffs that glinted under the crystal chandeliers. I followed slowly behind them, walking through my own front doors and stepping out onto the massive stone porch of the estate. The crisp October night air bit at my bare shoulders, but the cold felt incredibly refreshing after the suffocating toxic humidity of the dining room. The scene outside was a chaotic, brilliant symphony of flashing red and blue lights. More than a dozen police cruisers, unmarked federal SUVs, and local law enforcement vehicles were parked erratically across the circular gravel driveway spilling out onto the perfectly manicured street. The heavy, rhythmic thumping of police radios cut through the quiet suburban night. But the police presence was not the most devastating part of the scene waiting for my parents. It was the neighbors. In this exclusive, highly gated community, reputation was the only currency that truly mattered. Everyone knew everyone, and everyone judged everyone relentlessly. The sheer volume of sirens had drawn the entire neighborhood out of their multi-million-dollar mansions. Men in expensive cashmere sweaters and women in designer silk robes were standing at the very edge of my property line, and every single one of them was holding up a glowing smartphone. Patricia stepped out onto the porch and instantly froze. The flashing police lights illuminated the eager, gossiping faces of the women she played tennis with at the country club, the men Richard golfed with on Sunday mornings, and the rival socialites she had desperately tried to outshine for 30 years. They were not offering help. They were not looking away out of polite respect. They were recording her absolute destruction in high definition, ready to post the footage to their private neighborhood group chats and local community boards. It was the ultimate, inescapable walk of shame. "Oh my God," Patricia whispered, her voice trembling with a fresh wave of sheer, unadulterated terror as she realized she was on display. "No, please no, not out here, not in front of them." She tried to turn around aggressively, attempting to retreat back into the safety of the house, but the female agent held her firmly in place. Patricia's knees buckled. She looked wildly over her shoulder and locked eyes with me. I was standing at the top of the stone steps, perfectly framed by the warm golden light spilling from the open front doors. I had picked up my crystal champagne flute on the way out, and I held it loosely in my hand, watching her with total emotional detachment. "Danielle." Patricia cried out, her voice echoing loudly across the quiet, affluent street. The neighbors visibly leaned in their cameras, zooming in on the unfolding drama. "Please, Danielle, you have to tell them this is a massive mistake. Tell the officers it is just a family misunderstanding. I will sign whatever you want. I will leave the state. I will give you everything. Just do not let them parade me out there in front of everyone. My reputation will be completely ruined. I will never be able to show my face in this town again." She was still negotiating. Even now, wearing steel handcuffs and facing decades in a federal prison for massive mortgage fraud, her primary concern was what the women at the country club would think of her. It was the purest, most pathetic distillation of her narcissism. She cared more about her image than her own freedom. I took a slow step forward, looking down at her from the top of the stairs, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make her squirm. "Your reputation is exactly what it should be." "Mom," I said, keeping my voice clear and loud enough for the closest recording neighbors to hear every single word. "You spent 30 years pretending to be better than everyone else. You funded your extravagant garden parties and your luxury cars with stolen money. You forged my signature, you drained my inheritance, and you lied to the entire world to maintain a fake illusion of wealth. This is not a misunderstanding. This is the reality you built." "I am your mother!" She screamed, a guttural, ugly sound of pure desperation that echoed through the trees. "And I am the bank," I replied coldly, taking a sip of my champagne, "and your account is completely overdrawn." The federal agent gave Patricia a firm push forward, forcing her down the stone steps toward the waiting squad car. Richard was already being shoved into the back of a separate cruiser. My father, the man who had always demanded absolute respect and submission from everyone around him, was forced to duck his head to fit into the cramped back seat of a police car. He did not look at me. He did not look at the recording neighbors. He just stared at the floorboards, completely broken and defeated by his own boundless greed. Patricia fought the officers all the way to the car door. She kicked her expensive heels against the gravel, screaming for someone to call her lawyer, begging the neighbors to stop recording her humiliation. But the neighbors did not stop. The affluent crowd just watched in stunned, fascinated silence as the self-proclaimed queen of their suburban social circle was unceremoniously stuffed into the back of a police cruiser like a common street criminal. The heavy metal door slammed shut behind her. The sharp sound echoed across the driveway, cutting off her hysterical screaming instantly. Through the thick tinted glass of the squad car window, I could see the faint outline of her face pressed against the glass, looking back at the beautiful, sprawling estate she had stolen and subsequently lost forever. Jamal was escorted out next. He kept his head firmly down, completely ignoring the flashing cameras and the whispers of the crowd. The charming, fast-talking investment broker had absolutely nothing left to say. He was loaded into an unmarked black federal SUV headed straight for a holding cell where his fake luxury watch and custom-tailored suit would be permanently traded for a standard-issue orange jumpsuit. I stood on my front porch feeling the gentle autumn breeze rustle the heavy fabric of my designer dress. The flashing lights painted the massive white pillars of my house in alternating shades of red and blue. I raised my crystal flute, took one final deliberate sip of the vintage champagne, and watched the long line of police vehicles slowly pull out of my driveway, taking the toxic waste of my past away with them. The wail of the sirens faded into the distance, leaving a ringing heavy silence in their wake. The neighborhood spectators, realizing the main spectacle had concluded, began to slowly shuffle back to their respective mansions. Their screens were glowing in the dark, fingers typing frantically as they uploaded the absolute destruction of my parents to every private community group chat in the county. The social execution was complete. I turned around, the cool night breeze sweeping across my shoulders, and walked back through the grand double doors of my estate. The massive foyer was eerily quiet. The catering staff had efficiently packed up and vanished, leaving behind only the faint scent of roasted garlic and the lingering chill of the open doors. The jazz band was gone. The angry investors were gone. For the first time in 34 years, the house felt clean. It felt like it actually belonged to me. Danielle. A small, pathetic voice echoed from the shadowed hallway leading to the guest wing. I stopped near the base of the grand staircase and turned. Brittany stepped slowly into the warm light of the foyer. The golden child of the family looked completely unrecognizable. She had stripped off the ruined, punch-stained designer gown and was wearing a pair of oversized gray sweatpants and a faded college hoodie. Her expensive blonde extensions were tangled and matted. Her face was scrubbed raw, though dark smudges of waterproof mascara still clung to the corners of her eyes. She was dragging a single leather duffel bag behind her, the heavy brass wheels scraping loudly against the pristine hardwood floor. I looked at my watch. It was 9:47. "You are 2 minutes past the deadline, Brittany," I said, my voice echoing in the empty hall. "The front door is right behind me." Brittany stopped a few feet away, her hands trembling as she gripped the handle of her bag. She looked around the empty, cavernous house, her eyes wide with a frantic, animalistic panic. She did not march toward the door. Instead, she let go of her bag and took a hesitant step toward me. "I have nowhere to go," she whispered, her voice cracking. I raised an eyebrow, taking a slow sip of my champagne. "That is unfortunate, but it is not my problem." "It is." "You do not understand, Danielle," she cried, taking another step closer. Her hands flew up, gesturing wildly in the air. "I just checked my banking app. It is entirely locked." The federal agents did not just arrest Jamal, they froze every single account associated with his firm and his marital assets. My checking, my savings, my credit cards, they are all frozen. I have exactly $14 in cash inside my purse. My husband is in a federal holding cell, my parents are in jail, and I literally have nothing. She looked at me with wide, pleading eyes, waiting for the familiar safety net of the family to catch her. She was waiting for me to step into the role of the responsible older sister, to fix the mess she had willingly ignored for years. "I am your sister!" Brittany sobbed, tears spilling over her eyelashes and cutting through the smudged makeup on her cheeks. "We are blood. I know we have had our differences, and I know Mom and Dad were awful to you. But Jamal lied to me too. He used me. I am a victim in this, just like you are. We need to stick together. Just let me stay in the guest room, just for a few weeks until the lawyers clear up my bank accounts. I will stay completely out of your way. You will not even know I am here. Please, Danielle." She reached out, trying to grab my hand, desperate to play the sisterhood card now that her entire world had been incinerated. I smoothly stepped back, keeping my physical space entirely secure. I looked at her outstretched hand and felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no guilt, no lingering sense of familial obligation. "A victim," I repeated the word, rolling off my tongue like a piece of sour fruit. "You think you are a victim in this house." "I was manipulated," Brittany wailed, dropping her hands to her sides. "They lied to me." "They did not lie to you, Brittany," I said, my voice dropping to a low, razor-sharp edge that made her flinch. "You just did not care where the money came from as long as it kept flowing directly into your closet. Do not stand in my foyer and pretend you were some innocent hostage. You were an active participant in every single cruel thing they ever did to me." Brittany shook her head rapidly. "No, I was not. I was just a kid when they were hard on you." "You were not a kid 2 hours ago," I snapped, stepping directly into her space and forcing her to look me in the eye. 2 hours ago, when Mom shoved a cheap plastic plate into my chest and told me to go eat in the drafty garage so I would not embarrass Jamal in front of his wealthy clients, what did you do? Did you stand up for me? Did you tell Mom she was being cruel? No. You stood at the VIP table drinking vintage champagne and you laughed. Brittany opened her mouth to speak, but I did not give her a single second to formulate a lie. "And when I was 18, I continued, my voice gaining volume and ringing off the crystal chandeliers. When Dad stole my $40,000 college fund to buy that Mercedes, you were 15. You were old enough to know exactly why I was sobbing in the kitchen. You were old enough to know why I had to work 3 night shift jobs just to afford community college textbooks. But a week later, you were taking selfies in the passenger seat of that stolen car, bragging to your friends about how rich your father was." Brittany's face went entirely pale. She stared at me, the desperate facade of sisterhood completely melting away to reveal the terrified, entitled brat underneath. "You loved it," I whispered, staring her down. "You loved being the golden child. You loved that they tore me down because it made you feel superior. You never once questioned how a failing investment broker and 2 unemployed socialites were paying for your matching SUVs and your diamond earrings. You turned a blind eye to the fraud because you were the primary beneficiary of the abuse." I stepped back, pointing a perfectly manicured finger directly at the heavy oak front doors. "You are not a victim, Brittany. You are an accomplice, and the Bank of Danielle is officially and permanently closed. Get out of my house. Brittany stared at me for 5 agonizing seconds. She looked for any crack in my armor, any lingering trace of the older sister she used to torment. She found nothing but solid, impenetrable steel. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She really was entirely alone. With a shaking hand, she reached down and grabbed the handle of her single leather duffel bag. She turned away from me, her shoulders slumped in absolute defeat, and walked slowly toward the exit. She stepped over the threshold, her sneakers crunching softly against the gravel driveway. The cold October wind immediately whipped her hair across her face. She stopped and turned back around, shivering in the brisk night air, perhaps hoping to offer one final pathetic plea for mercy. I did not give her the chance. I gripped the edge of the heavy, solid oak front door and slammed it shut right in her face. The massive door secured with a thunderous boom that shook the floorboards. I reached out and turned the heavy brass deadbolt, the loud metallic click echoing through the silent, empty house. The final tie was severed. The toxic waste was gone. The house was finally mine. 2 weeks later, the satisfying echo of that heavy brass deadbolt still resonated in my memory. But the cold, chaotic air of that October night had been entirely replaced by the quiet, temperature-controlled environment of a sleek downtown Chicago law firm. I sat in a plush leather chair in the corner office of Mr. Harrington's firm, looking out through the floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling city skyline. The morning sun cast a bright, optimistic glow over the polished mahogany desk where a neat stack of final settlement documents awaited my signature. Mr. Harrington walked into the room holding 2 steaming cups of coffee. He handed one to me with a warm, genuine smile that stood in stark contrast to the nervous, sweating man he had been at the anniversary party. He took his seat behind the massive desk and opened a thick leather binder. "Well, Danielle," Mr. Harrington began, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "I have been practicing estate law for nearly 40 years, and I can honestly say I have never seen a situation unravel quite as spectacularly as yours did. But more importantly, I have never seen a client execute a recovery strategy with such absolute surgical precision. Your grandfather's trust is officially and entirely secured." He slid a heavy embossed document across the desk. It was the finalized deed to the estate, stripped of all fraudulent liens and secondary mortgages. Next to it was the consolidated portfolio statement for Grandpa Theodore's investment accounts. The numbers printed at the bottom of the page were staggering, representing decades of shrewd, quiet investments that my parents had tried so desperately to steal. I picked up the heavy gold pen resting on the desk and signed my name on the dotted line, legally closing the darkest chapter of my life. As I set the pen down, I took a sip of the hot coffee. "How is the fallout looking on your end, Mr. Harrington? I know the federal prosecutors have been aggressively subpoenaing your records." Mr. Harrington chuckled, shaking his head in sheer disbelief. "Aggressive is an understatement. The federal prosecutors have absolutely buried your former family under a mountain of indictments. Let us start with Jamal. The SEC and the FBI coordinated a joint task force to dismantle his boutique investment firm. It turns out his Ponzi scheme was even worse than your initial forensic audit uncovered. He had defrauded nearly 50 investors out of almost $15 million. I leaned back in my chair, feeling a deep sense of professional and personal vindication. "Will he take a plea deal?" "The federal prosecutors are not offering him one," Mr. Harrington replied, flipping to a new page in his binder. "Because the victims were prominent, wealthy members of the community who provided immediate, corroborated statements, that night the case is airtight." Jamal was denied bail as an extreme flight risk. He is currently sitting in a federal holding facility in downtown Chicago. His public defender told the judge they expect a minimum sentence of 10 years in federal prison. And because his crimes involved wire fraud and interstate commerce, he will serve at least 85% of that time without the possibility of early parole. I nodded slowly. The smooth-talking con artist who had cornered me in my own driveway and demanded I sign away my birthright was now wearing a bright orange jumpsuit, locked in a concrete cell for the next decade of his life. It was exactly what he deserved. "And what about my parents?" I asked, keeping my voice completely steady. Mr. Harrington sighed, though there was no real sympathy in his eyes. "Richard and Patricia are facing catastrophic legal and financial ruin. The forensic accounting trail you provided to the FBI left them absolutely zero room to maneuver or hide assets. Every offshore account they tried to conceal, every shell company they attempted to use as a buffer, was dragged out into the broad daylight of federal court. Because they used the stolen mortgage funds to directly facilitate Jamal's federal crimes, their remaining assets were completely frozen under federal forfeiture laws. The luxury cars were impounded by the leasing company. Their bank accounts were seized by the IRS to cover the unpaid taxes. They are completely and utterly bankrupt. Where are they staying? I asked, curious about how the self-proclaimed king and queen of the affluent suburbs were handling their new reality. Mr. Harrington looked down at his notes. According to the court filings, they are currently residing in a cheap motel off Interstate 90, a budget lodge that charges by the week. Their passports have been confiscated, and they are restricted from leaving the state while they await trial for aggravated identity theft and bank fraud. Because they have absolutely no liquid cash left, they were forced to use a court-appointed public defender. A public defender who is currently juggling 80 other cases and has barely had time to return your father's frantic phone calls. A slow, satisfied smile spread across my face. My mother, who had spent my entire life obsessing over designer labels, country club memberships, and projecting an image of flawless wealth, was now living in a dingy highway motel. She was sharing a tiny, poorly ventilated room with the husband she despised, waking up every single morning to the roar of semi-trucks instead of the gentle chirping of suburban birds. The absolute humiliation of her new reality was a punishment far worse than any prison sentence the judge could hand down. And Brittany, I asked, almost as an afterthought, "Your sister tried to crash on the couches of her wealthy friends from the country club," Mr. Harrington said, closing the leather binder. "But the moment the neighborhood group chats exploded with the videos of your parents being arrested, she became a complete social pariah. Nobody wanted to be associated with a family of convicted fraudsters. Her friends blocked her number. Last I heard, she moved into a small apartment in a less desirable part of the city with 2 roommates she found online. She had to take a job at a retail clothing store just to pay for her groceries." The golden child who had spent 30 years having everything handed to her on a silver platter was finally being forced to work for a living. She was folding the exact same cheap clothes she used to ruthlessly mock me for wearing when we were teenagers. The poetic justice was absolutely flawless. I pulled my cell phone out of my designer handbag and unlocked the screen. I opened the messaging app and scrolled down to the family group chat. For years, that chat had been a constant source of anxiety, a digital battleground where my mother sent passive-aggressive articles, where Brittany flaunted her unearned wealth, and where my father issued his tyrannical demands. Now the screen was completely blank. No one had sent a single message since the night of the anniversary party. The toxic noise that had plagued my entire existence had been permanently silenced. The family group chat was completely dead. I deleted the chat thread entirely, watching the names vanish from my screen forever. "Thank you for everything, Mr. Harrington," I said, standing up and smoothing the skirt of my tailored suit. "You have been an incredible ally through all of this." "The pleasure was entirely mine, Danielle," he replied, standing up to shake my hand. "Your grandfather would be incredibly proud of the woman you have become. You protected his legacy perfectly." I walked out of the law firm and stepped onto the bustling Chicago sidewalk. The midday sun was shining brightly, reflecting off the glass skyscrapers towering above me. For the first time in 34 years, I did not feel the crushing, invisible weight of my family expectations dragging me down. I was a highly successful forensic accountant. I owned a multi-million-dollar estate outright. I was financially secure, legally protected, and entirely independent. I took a deep breath of the crisp autumn air, feeling a profound sense of peace settle over my soul. The nightmare was finally over. I had survived the fire and I had emerged completely victorious. A few days after that liberating walk down the Chicago sidewalk, I found myself standing in the center of the massive, cavernous attic of my estate. The main floors below me were completely empty. I had hired a professional removal crew to strip the house of every single piece of tacky, overpriced furniture my parents had bought with their stolen money. The imported Italian leather sofas, the ridiculous crystal vases, and the gaudy oil paintings had all been hauled away to be auctioned off, the proceeds going straight back into the trust. The house was finally a blank canvas, but the attic was a different story entirely. The attic was a forgotten time capsule. My mother had always hated coming up here, complaining about the dust and the lack of climate control, so she had simply ignored it. For decades, it had remained untouched, serving as the final resting place for the genuine history of our family. Sunlight streamed through the small, circular dormer windows, illuminating dancing motes of dust in the quiet air. I wore a pair of faded jeans and an old t-shirt, a sharp contrast to the designer suits I usually wore, and spent the morning physically sorting through the boxes of my grandfather's actual belongings. In the darkest corner of the attic, pushed behind a stack of broken picture frames and old winter coats, I found a heavy cedar chest. The brass hinges were oxidized and green with age. I pulled it out into the center of the room, kneeling on the rough wooden floorboards, and pried the heavy lid open. The rich, earthy scent of cedar and old paper immediately filled the air. Inside the chest were rows of beautifully bound leather books. I pulled one out and opened it, a soft smile automatically touching my lips. They were my grandfather's original accounting ledgers from when he first started building his commercial real estate empire in the late 70s. As a forensic accountant, looking at his perfectly organized columns, his meticulous handwriting, and his flawless balancing of assets and liabilities was like looking at a piece of fine art. I traced my fingers over the faded ink, feeling a deep, profound connection to the man who had shaped my entire analytical mind. I reached deeper into the chest, pulling out ledger after ledger, completely absorbed in the history of his hard work. Near the very bottom, hidden beneath a stack of thick property deeds, my hand brushed against a heavy cream-colored envelope. I pulled it out into the light. My breath caught in my throat. Written across the front of the envelope in my grandfather's distinct sharp cursive was my name, Danielle. The seal was unbroken. It had been sitting in this dark cedar chest for years, patiently waiting for the day I would finally take possession of the house and find it. My hands trembled slightly as I slid my fingernail under the flap and carefully opened the envelope. I pulled out 3 pages of thick stationery paper covered in his familiar handwriting. I sat back on my heels, leaning against a sturdy wooden support beam, and began to read. My dearest Danielle, the letter began, if you are reading this, it means you have finally taken your rightful place in this house. It also means I am no longer there to see the incredible woman I know you have become. I am writing this letter because there are truths I could not speak out loud while I was alive, truths I needed you to know so you could finally heal from the wounds of this family. I paused, swallowing hard against the sudden tightness in my throat. I blinked back the moisture gathering in my eyes and forced myself to continue reading. I know what your parents are, Danielle. I have always known. I watched Richard let his arrogance blind him to honest work, and I watched Patricia let her vanity consume her soul. More importantly, I watched how they treated you. I saw the quiet cruelty. I saw how they pushed you into the shadows while parading Brittany around in the light. I saw them resent your intelligence because it intimidated them, and I saw them punish your independence because they could not control it. A single tear slipped down my cheek, dropping silently onto the dusty wooden floorboards. For 34 years, I had convinced myself that I was entirely alone in my suffering. I had believed that no one saw the emotional abuse, the gaslighting, and the blatant favoritism. But Grandpa Theodore had seen it all. You might wonder why I never confronted them directly. The letter continued. You might wonder why I let you work those grueling night shifts at the diner when you were 18, or why I did not have Richard arrested the moment I found out he emptied your college fund. I stayed silent because confronting a narcissist only teaches them to hide their poison better. If I had cut Richard off entirely back then, he would have made your daily life a living hell out of pure spite. I could not protect you from their daily cruelty without making you their ultimate target. So instead of fighting a loud, useless war, I built a silent fortress for your future. I looked up from the pages, staring out the dusty dormer window at the sprawling green lawn of the estate. The sheer magnitude of his love and strategic brilliance washed over me. He had played the long game just like a true accountant. I put this entire estate into an irrevocable trust in your name, because you are the only person in this bloodline with the integrity to handle it. You earned your strength the hardest way possible. You built your own life from the ground up, completely independent of their toxic money and their conditional love. I wanted you to become exactly who you are today before I handed you the keys to the kingdom. I needed you to be strong enough to lock the doors when they inevitably tried to break in. I read the final paragraph, my vision completely blurred by thick, unstoppable tears. Do not ever let them convince you that you owed them your grace. You owe them absolutely nothing. This house, this legacy, and the beautiful life you are going to build inside these walls belong entirely to you. You were never the outcast, Danielle. You were always my chosen heir. I am so incredibly proud of you. Love, Grandpa. I lowered the letter to my lap and finally broke down. I sat alone in the dusty attic of my multi-million-dollar estate and cried. But for the first time in my entire life, they were not tears of humiliation, anger, or betrayal. They were tears of absolute profound release. The deep aching wound in my chest, the inner child who had spent decades wondering why she was never good enough to sit at the main dining table, was finally healed. The validation was the ultimate catharsis. I had spent the last few weeks systematically destroying my parents in boardrooms and police stations, relying on cold, hard logic and federal laws. But this letter gave me the one thing the legal system never could. It gave me the absolute certainty that I was loved, that I was seen, and that my pain was real. I carefully folded the heavy stationery, pressing it against my chest, and let the quiet peace of the attic surround me. The war was over, and I was finally home. 6 months have passed since that quiet afternoon in the attic. The changing seasons brought a harsh, cleansing Chicago winter, which slowly melted away into a bright, optimistic spring. The physical transformation of the estate has been just as dramatic as the shift in my own life. I completely gutted the interior of the house, hiring a team of contractors to tear down the heavy, oppressive floral wallpapers and rip up the dark, dated carpets my mother prized so highly. The gaudy crystal chandeliers she bought with stolen money are gone, replaced by sleek, modern fixtures that cast a warm, inviting glow. The house finally breathes. It no longer feels like a suburban fortress built on lies, debt, and financial ruin. It feels like a sanctuary. It feels like an authentic reflection of who I am. Even the drafty garage, the exact place my mother tried to banish me to on the night of the anniversary party, has been completely transformed. I cleared out the junk, insulated the walls, and turned it into a beautiful home gym and yoga studio. Every time I walk in there, I am reminded of the absolute power of reclaiming my space. Tonight, the long gravel driveway is once again filled with cars. But there are no valets running frantically back and forth, no rented luxury vehicles, and absolutely no fake luxury watches in sight. I am hosting my very first dinner party since taking full ownership of the property. The grand dining room, the exact spot where my former family cannibalized themselves in front of 150 wealthy strangers, is completely unrecognizable. I replaced the massive, intimidating formal dining table with a beautiful custom-made walnut table that encourages closeness and genuine conversation. Sitting around this table are the people who actually matter. This is my chosen family. To my right is Mr. Harrington, laughing warmly at a clever joke told by my managing partner from the accounting firm. Across from them are my closest friends from college, the brilliant women who let me sleep on their couches when I was working 3 jobs just to survive. There is no tension in the air tonight. There is no unspoken hierarchy, no passive-aggressive comments disguised as jokes, and no fear of stepping out of line or ruining an artificial image. There is only the rich, comforting sound of genuine laughter and the clinking of wine glasses filled with honest celebration. I stand up at the head of the table, tapping my crystal glass lightly with a silver spoon. The joyful conversation naturally lulls, and a dozen smiling faces turn to look at me. I raise my glass, making eye contact with each of them. I want to thank you all for being here tonight. I say, my voice steady and filled with absolute gratitude. For a very long time, I was taught that a seat at the table was conditional. I was taught that I had to earn my place by shrinking myself, by accepting disrespect, and by playing a supporting role in someone else's grand illusion. But looking around this room, I realize that true family does not make you earn your basic human dignity. True family pulls out a chair for you exactly as you are. So here is to the family we choose. They raise their glasses in unison, their smiles warm and deeply validating. As they return to their lively conversations, passing plates of roasted vegetables and perfectly seared salmon. I take a step back from the table. I walk toward the open French doors leading out to the patio, feeling the cool, refreshing evening breeze against my skin. I turn away from the lively dining room and look directly at you, the person listening to this story right now. I know exactly how hard it is to walk away. When you are raised in a toxic environment, you are systematically conditioned to believe that you are the problem. Society constantly tells us that blood is thicker than water, that family is everything, and that you must forgive your parents simply because they gave you life. But I am here to tell you that blood does not equal loyalty. Biology is not a free pass for emotional abuse. You do not owe your abusers a seat at your table, even if they are the ones who brought you into this world. If you are currently sitting at a table where you are belittled, ignored, or made to feel like you are fundamentally broken, please listen to me. Get up. Walk away. It will be the most terrifying thing you ever do, and the guilt will try to pull you back, but the peace waiting for you on the other side is worth every single ounce of fear. You have the absolute power to build your own table. You have the right to curate your own life, to surround yourself with people who celebrate your successes rather than sabotage them out of jealousy. Have you ever had to draw a hard line with toxic family members? Have you ever packed your bags and walked away from people who demanded your ultimate respect but adamantly refused to give it in return? I want to read your stories. Scroll down right now and leave a comment telling me how you took your power back. Share your experiences, because your survival story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today to finally find their own strength to leave a bad situation. If my journey resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. We are building a strong community here, a chosen family of survivors who refuse to be silenced or shamed by the people who tried to break us. Share this video with a friend, a coworker, or anyone who needs a powerful reminder that they are entirely worthy of a life filled with genuine love and respect. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening to my truth. My name is Danielle, and I am finally sitting exactly where I belong. Stay strong, stay unapologetic, and I will see you in the next story.